Welcome everyone, Christine here with a race ranking video for Total War Warhammer 3. Now, I've done a video covering the races in patch 4.0 and where I think they land based on how good their campaign experiences are. But in this one, I just want to talk about pure racial strength, which are the strongest races in the game at the moment, and why is that? And the reason I'm doing this video is apparently a lot of people only care about this particular aspect. So, let's just get started with it. Starting with the Beastmen. Where do I think the Beastmen land? The Beastmen are a solid B tier. They're good in the mid-late game once you get the hordes rolling, once you get Hearthstones, once you get Dread, once you get hero capacity, unit capacity, the Legendary Lords. They're very strong. In fact, in the end game, you could consider them even S tier. But when it comes to the early game, they're certainly far lower than that. You could even consider the early game of the Beastmen, with the exception of Taurox, as a D tier. So it kind of ends up in a B tier. Especially considering the meat of a campaign, the main challenge of a campaign, the struggles you're going to face are going to be in the early game. Beastmen have a lot of power, but it is something that builds up rather than having it instantly, and you're quite vulnerable early on in the campaign. Then we have Bretonnia, also B tier. They have great cavalry, good access to artillery early on, good hero selection actually in their campaigns, and even pretty decent lord selection. The problem with Bretonnia, they don't have an infantry roster that's great, so they're going to struggle in a lot of the sieges that the game does have, and yeah, not having infantry is a significant downside. Also, the limitation because of vows, and even the limitation that you will face in a campaign climate-wise, if you will, from the perspective of Blue and Leoncoeur or the Fey Enchantress. Alberic and Rapance are in a better state of affairs, but Bretonnia, they're not a bad race, far from it. They're just kind of middle of the road. They're not bad, they're not great. That's how I view them from a strength ranking. Cathay, S tier. From a pure strength perspective, Cathay is absolutely an S tier race. They have really strong early game infantry, they have strong ranged units from very early on in their campaign. Their early game army works, their dragons are strong, the artillery is strong, the monstrous units, the Terracotta Sentinels are strong units. The only limitation Cathay does have in their campaign is because of climate, but that's not really something that affects their strength, it just affects how much you can achieve in a campaign. So Cathay campaigns are certainly limited, but in the early game, they tend to dominate in every corner of the map. Just look at what Yan Bo can do, or Xiaoming. Miao Ying, less so, but still, all of them are fairly powerful Legendary Lords with a good amount of army potential, economic potential. Cathay is still limited. They could use some more units, they could use a melee hero, but certainly Creative Assembly has improved them as a race with the Shadows of Change patch. Then we get Chaos Dwarves. Chaos Dwarves are also an S tier. They are a race that does need to grow to reach their full potential, and their full potential with artillery and endgame units fully upgraded is quite ridiculous. I think the Chaos Dwarves may have the strongest armies on the campaign in an endgame, but they do need to build it up with industry. The difference between Chaos Dwarves and Beastmen, though, is that Chaos Dwarves have access to some fairly decent units in the early game, and they have access to all the climate types in the campaign, which makes their which prevents their campaigns from being limited. They avoid the pitfalls that the Beastmen have in their campaign in the early game, given the unit limitations the Beastmen have, like Ungor Raiders versus Hobgoblins. It's not even a contest, it's not even in the same universe. So strong early game armies, strong late game armies. Actually, the Chaos Dwarves can struggle a bit in the mid game, like you need to build up a lot of industry to take advantage of that. But if you do manage that, if you do play your cards right, they are incredibly strong as race. Daniel, F tier. And if I need to explain why Daniel is F tier, I don't think you've been playing much of Warhammer 3. That's all I'm gonna say. Issues in the campaign mechanics aren't great, the unit roster isn't great, the economy is one of the most awful economies in the entire game, the starting position isn't great, like starting between Archaon, Boris Ursus, and Malice Darkblade is just asking for trouble. And here's the thing, even if you do play well with Daniel, even if you play to the maximum potential, even if you're a great player, he's still gonna be really bad. So yeah, easy F tier. Dark Elves, S tier. I know a lot of people are going to disagree with that, but strong unit roster from beginning to end in the campaign. Sure, some of the end game units are not as good as, say, Chosen as an example, or Way Watchers, but it's overall a fairly solid unit roster The artillery is pretty weak, but outside of that, like, the infantry is good, the range units are good, the monsters are good, the lords are good, the casters are good, the magic that the Dark Elves have is good, their economy is fairly strong. There's a lot of things to like about the Dark Elves, and I think we need to move past this idea that the Dark Elves are somehow bad. I understand people dislike the design philosophy, like people who really like the Dark Elves in Warhammer 2 dislike. Many people dislike how they were designed in Warhammer 3, but that doesn't mean the Dark Elves are weak. Far from it. They are incredibly strong. Morathi is incredibly strong. Malus Darkblade is strong. Malekith, yeah, some issues in the early game, but he's also a very strong Legendary Lord, and you can make it work. You might have to put a bit more effort, but all of them are in a very strong situation. Rakarth is the only one that's limited because it takes him time to traverse the terrain of Lustria, so he's not going to accomplish as much, and especially a problem for the Dark Elves, which are a very aggressive early game race. But every other campaign, Lokir, Morathi, Malekith, Malus Darkblade, yes, Helebron, they're all very strong Legendary Lords at the moment in Warhammer 3. Lots of potential, hero capacity, lord capacity, army capacity, economy, you name it. Everything that you might want from a very strong race, the Dark Elves have it. And I would certainly argue that they're far stronger than Cathay even. Dwarves, D tier. Now, the Dwarves have good armies. But here's the problem with the Dwarves. Their economy, while it's certainly solid, it's not capable of sustaining a lot of Dwarven armies. So while every single one of your armies that you do have in a campaign might win every battle they encounter, you're not going to have enough armies to cover a large swath of territory. And you're going to need to take a large swath of territory to support more than 2 armies, if even that. In fact, with your starting province in every campaign, you can't even maintain an entire stack of troops, which is an issue. Like, yeah, you can go Dwarf Warriors, Miners with Blasting Charges, but what you want to go is Artillery and Quarrelers, and that's something that requires more than one province to sustain. Another problem for the Dwarves is, like, the way many races overcome that issue of a weak economy, or an economy that's not good enough to sustain their armies, is they overcome it with post-battle loot. I think the Dwarves have the worst post-battle loot money amount in the entire game, and that's saying a lot for them. So they're in a bad situation. They really need a rework. Hopefully Thrones of Decay does provide that. Empire, easy F tier. The Imperial Authority system for Karl Franz and Balthazar Gelt is completely broken. Their early game army is absolutely garbage. Like, until you get to Great Swords, until you get to Hellstorms, and until you get Demigryphs and using Warrior Priests, you're just going to be in an awful state. And every single Imperial campaign, with the exception of Marcus Wolfhard, has far more powerful Legendary Lords that are far better to play around them, with none of the limitations in terms of campaign mechanics that the Empire has to deal with. And even Marcus Wolfhard has significant annoyances in his campaign that do limit his potential. Though he does have a lot of potential. Like, if I was to rate Marcus Wolfhard, I'd probably put him as C tier, but overall the Empire is in F tier. Weak early game, decent economy, to be sure, decent scalability, Volkmar especially, but really weak early game, weak mid game, limited campaign mechanics that do limit their potential in a significant amount. Greenskins, easy S tier. Very aggressive race that thrives on fighting a lot of battles, winning a lot of battles, gaining a biblical level of troops on the campaign map. Like, as the Greenskins, within 30 turns, it's not unusual to maintain like 6 full stacks, 5-6 full stacks. While your economy will certainly be in the red doing that, you will gain so much money from looting and sacking settlements that you will pay for them for all those 6 armies in a single battle. That is absurd. What also helps the Greenskins is that their units are cheap to recruit and also maintain a lot of them. Their buildings at the lower tier, not a higher tier, like at the higher tier they're reasonably expensive, but at a lower tier, their buildings at tier 1, tier 2, even tier 3, their buildings are quite cheap. So the Greenskins are masters at waging a war, sacking a settlement, taking over, rebuilding it, and they can do it very quickly as well because of their great growth. They have the best growth, or one of the best growths in the entire game, because they got the commandment that gives them a good amount of growth. They have a structure that gives them a good amount of growth. They also get the WA mechanic, which also gives them growth and control. Rebellions for the Greenskins don't really happen. growth is fast, and they also can recruit a lot of units very, very, very quickly. So those are all the advantages that the Greenskins have, and that's one of the reasons they are an easy S tier. High Elves. When it comes to High Elves, there's a good argument to be made that they deserve an S tier, but personally I think I don't believe that they deserve that same spot as the Cast Dwarves, Dark Elves, Greenskins, or even Cathay. The issue with the High Elves is that while they are a strong race with a really good early game army, one of the best in the game, like at least a basic army of spearmen and archers will defeat the vast majority of opponents. While you will struggle because of the lack of armor piercing, it is an army that gets the job done. The problem is the High Elves take a longer period of time than the S tier races to really get going. Even Cathay, yes, even Cathay. While they don't have the same replenishment issues that Cathay does have, because that's one of the weaknesses of Cathay, and they do have a better hero variety, campaign variety, terrain variety, climate suitability, it just takes longer. It takes time to grow, but once you do grow, they are a very strong race that has a lot of campaign potential. So they certainly deserve at least an A tier. Many people consider them an S tier. Hell, many people would argue that I should put the Dark Elves in D. But like the thing is, the Dark Elf early game army will defeat the High Elf early game army. And the thing is, as the Dark Elves, you'll bring heroes and magic to the battlefield. You'll have it's quite conceivable for every Dark Elven army to have magic, not through a lord like an Archmage or Supreme Sorcerers, but through a hero. That's something the High Elves just don't have. They have that severe limitation because hero capacity only increases at tier 4. So, limitations. It worked in Warhammer 2 because Warhammer 2 was slower. And Warhammer 3 is faster, so yes, I do think the High Elves do deserve to be knocked down a bit. Skarbrand. Everyone that's watched my videos for any length of time knows my opinion on Skarbrand from a perspective of how good his campaign is to play. From a power perspective, yes, he is an A tier. I am not going to give Skarbrand an S tier. Let me explain this. Why? I doubt many people that are going to complain are going to watch this video, but let me just explain this why. Skarbrand creates armies with bloodhosts, right? Those are disposable armies they get rid of, all that. Here's the difference. Skarbrand has one powerful army and all those bloodhosts, which are the disposable armies. You know what the difference is between Skarbrand, Dark Elves, Cathay? Greenskins? Like Greenskins especially, like compare that to Greenskins. Greenskins have real armies and disposable armies. Like every real army has a disposable army attached to it that you don't care about. They get more money from sacking settlements. They can capture territory. They get money from their economy. Like, I would genuinely say every Greenskins campaign is better at being corn than actual corn is. That said, Skarbrand's army early on, being able to get a lot of Cast Warriors, Bloodletters, 2 heroes, and Skarbrand himself. Like, Skarbrand can self-control armies. That's a significant amount of strength. The reason he doesn't get an S tier is because if you lose that army, like if you play well, you won't lose that army, but if you lose that army, it's game over. So you don't have any kind of crutch, you don't have a backup plan. It's like either you succeed with that one army or you fail. That is it. It can work brilliantly well, but I don't think he deserves an S tier. Because like Cast Dwarves, Dark Elves, Greenskins, Cathay, they do have backup plans. Like it does, like this is the thing. This is what makes a powerful race powerful. It's not just the ability of playing a campaign to perfection and succeeding well, it's also the ability of screwing up a lot and still dominating the map. And that's what makes the Cast Dwarves Dark Elves. Cast Dwarves a bit less than that, but they still are in a very dominant position, especially once they get rolling. Early on, they might be a bit vulnerable, or let's say the Cast Dwarves are a bit vulnerable between turns 20 and 40. But once they sort that out, and once they get the industry, and once they get multiple armies, they are an unstoppable tide of death and destruction. So, that's my reasoning for not giving Skarbrand S tier. Perspective on his campaign, it's not a great campaign to actually play. But strength-wise, yeah, he does have it, just not a great campaign dynamic. But that's not the reason I'm putting him A as opposed to S, it's just the other races are stronger. I'm gonna go with that. Kislev. This is a weird one to consider. So, if we're thinking about Boris Ursus, you could genuinely say Boris Ursus deserves an A tier. Even Mother Asankia as well. But if you're thinking Catherine Castalton, they could easily be considered F tier. The problem with Kislev as a race is that their economy is incredibly limited. So while your armies are certainly strong and you have casualty replenishment, you even have good magic, You have great range units right now with the Akshina ambushers from Shadow of Change. The armies of Kislev has never been really the problem. It's the limited economy. So Kislev suffers significantly because their economy is far weaker than the vast majority of races in the game. It's not quite as bad as Daniel. Very few races are as bad as Daniel, but it's still in a really bad spot. So the limited economy does hurt their campaigns quite a lot, because it means you just won't be able to maintain as many armies. Your post-battle loot is pretty solid, not quite on the level of Greenskins, but certainly good enough to maintain your campaign. But you're going to be spending a lot of that post-battle money to just maintain your armies, upgrade structures, to get some kind of decent level of economy. It does require a lot more effort, and while Boris Ursus can steamroll the map from turn 1, and he absolutely can, including Archeon, Frot, Trog, Azazel, Astankia has to fight for it, Catherine has to fight for it, far more so, Castalton has to fight for it, and severe limitations because of the supporter system, the devotion system, the invocations of the gods. They really needed an update, they didn't get one. Lizardmen, C tier. So Lizardmen are in that kind of spot where they're okay, but just not really fantastic. Their economy is solid enough, but they kind of fall in the same, they kind of have similar problems to the dwarves in that their armies are going to outpace their economy. Saurus in particular, because you don't want to get Saurus in every campaign except Tenuin, and that's only very early on. And of course Axiatl, though you do want to get Saurus even in an Axiatl campaign outside of Axiatl's own army. The thing about the Lizardmen, they're not in a bad spot, but they're not in a great spot either. So yeah, just kind of middle of the road between the other races. They have a decent unit roster, but realistically they're probably not going to see a lot of it because you can't afford it. Hero capacity does require you to get tier 4 settlements or even higher in order to unlock a lot of heroes. So you're going to have severe limitations on heroes. You're going to have severe limitations on units because of the economy. At least they can get decent enough replenishment. And their armies are decently strong to be able to handle the threats on the campaign map, but just fairly limited because, again, you can't maintain a lot of armies. Better than the dwarves and Kislev, though. Far better. Norska. How to rate Norska on a pure strength level? That's an interesting discussion. See, in terms of the army strength, Norska is certainly B. In terms of army strength. Lord-wise, they're absolutely F, because they only have one lord choice. Hero-wise, they're C, let's say. Decent enough heroes can be difficult to increase capacity. But here's the problem with Norska, and what drags them down. Their campaigns are just bugged right now. Their campaign mechanics don't work. The monster hunts don't work. The dynamic... Like, you're in the situation as Norska where to gain a lot of power, you need to sack settlements for the money to maintain those armies, but the problem is you also want to raise those settlements because you want to get favor of the gods. And it doesn't create a great campaign dynamic because gaining favor of the gods is power, but you also need armies to gain power. So it ends up being a clusterfuck, to say the least, for Norska to play Norska in any campaign. Their armies are solid, lacking artillery, lacking in range, only having fairly limited range options. But melee-wise, they're really solid. Especially when you're thinking about, like, yeah, Norscan Ice Trolls are pretty good right now, Mammoths are good, Marauder Champions are good, but just the limitations. Their economy requires you to rely on sacking and looting settlements, which makes sense for Norska, but at the same time you also want to raise those settlements, so you end up being limited in a campaign. So that limits their potential, that limits their strength ranking. I don't think it's quite as bad as the dwarves or Kislev from a pure strength perspective. I would probably rate them lower than dwarves and Kislev, like from how the campaign actually are. But strength wise, yeah, they're not quite as bad, but they do have issues. Kugath, F tier. Same situation as Daniel. Limited unit roster, bad economy, bad starting situation. Just a really bad campaign design overall for Kugath. The problem for Kugath is the fact that he has to pay up front for basically every tier of structures he's getting, and he's not getting those benefits instantly. No. He has to wait, and it's a cycle, so you don't constantly get those benefits. No, you get them eventually for one turn, for a couple of turns, and then they cycle back. Having a variable economy when you control safe territory, is not a great situation. Your recruitment is limited. The only saving grace is for Kugaf. The only reasons he's better than Daniel is he can get a lot of heroes in his campaign, because resources can increase hero capacity by a lot. He can get a lot of heroes, and he can make hero armies combined with Marauders of Nurgle and then Warriors of Chaos of Nurgle and Chosen of Nurgle work quite well. But it is very weak, and it's like Kugaf gets hard counter by every faction surrounds him. Imrik can hard counter him, the Chaos Dwarves can hard counter him, Gorst hard counters him. Like, the only one that doesn't hard counter Kugaf is Greasus, and even then that's not necessarily saying a lot. Speaking about Greasus, yeah, and the Ogres, easy F tier. I think they're worse than Empire, not quite as bad as Kugaf. Limited economy, everything tied to economy, hero capacity, and recruitment being tied to camps. Having very limited camps does limit the potential the Ogres have in a campaign. If we could actually use the full potential of the Ogres, their full unit roster, much earlier in the campaign, as opposed to just playing an early game with Noblars, Ogre Bulls, and Saber Tusks, and eventually Gorgers and Iron Guts, it would be a lot better. If we can maintain more than 2 free armies in the early game, it would be a lot better. Like, it's a race that, if we could get more camps, and those camps were more meaningful, and we could get access to units easier, the Ogres would be a really good race, but they're not. Also, their post-battle loot when sacking settlements is not that great either. So yeah, they're one of the weakest races in the game at the moment, and it follows the trend of pre-order DLC being bad. I wonder why they abandoned that for Pharaoh. Gee. Skaven. I think Skaven are an A tier. Many people actually would argue S. There's a lot of reasons why Skaven are an S tier race, but there's also reasons why they're not. Skaven require full control of territories to really maximize their economic potential. Their barracks chain is completely worthless, so Skaven, Slays, Crown Rats, Storm Vermin, worthless. So you're needing to get to tier 2 to recruit any kind of decent unit in a Skaven campaign to begin with. Which is not a problem, because you can instantly get the tier 2 settlement from the first element you're taking, so not really that big of an issue for Skaven to deal with, but still a limiting factor in their campaigns. And combine that with needing entire provinces to really maximize the economic potential of provinces, and being universally hated by everyone, it does limit the Skaven somewhat. They're still a great race, they're still a great deal of fun, they still have a lot of power. Even Tretch, who's worthless as a Legendary Lord, still pretty damn powerful. Just limitations on the campaign. Nakari. Nakari is in an interesting spot. Nakari is, you could argue B, A, or S. Depends on how you want to view it. So Nakari is powerful because you can vassalize other factions, and you can do so in a much better way than any other faction in the game, except Azazel. So you can get forced vassalization, and you can vassalize factions that have all their territory, and that gives you a lot of power. Problem with Nakari is the army roster of Nakari is bad. If you're playing Nakari without Champions of Chaos, good luck. That's not a fun experience. And even when you overcome your opponents, that doesn't get necessarily that much better because you have bad replenishment. So you're in this kind of weird situation where there's a lot of things that make Nakari powerful. Like the campaign mechanics of Slaanesh, easy S tier. Like the cults, the vassalization aspect, even the economic potential, easy S tier. The army that Nakari has, yeah, F tier for the army. So B, that's the most I can give it, honestly. Like, giving Nakari more than a B tier from a strength perspective is not really great. I think Nakari is better to play than Skarbrand, but like in terms of pure strength ranking, like Skarbrand at least has good replenishment for his army, not for the Blood Host. But at least he can get that. Nakari does get a ridiculous amount of cult armies, which are actually good armies, and they're not quite as disposable as the Blood Host, but still. Tomb Kings. Tomb Kings. I think Tomb Kings are an easy C tier in terms of their strength. They do work. They do, and if you build them up, if you get artillery, if you get a lot of Tomb Guard, if you get the huge constructs, they're really powerful in battle. The problem is, like with other races that aren't so great, It's the early game situation. Limited to one army unless you're playing Archon the Black, but Archon the Black is like in a completely different universe than all the other Tomb King Legendary Lords. So the limitations that Tomb Kings had, which made sense in Warhammer 2, again, slower campaign, more limited army, supply lines, don't make sense within the context of Warhammer 3, and we're still dealing with those mechanics. Also, Books in the Gash are broken. Well, not broken, they work, but it creates an annoying situation on a campaign map where you have to attack factions that you might want to ally just to get the book, because you can't get it from Military Alliance. Unlike the Cast Dwarves in Forik Ironbrow, just gonna point that out. Siege. I'm gonna hate myself for this one, but S tier. Not Kairos. Kairos is an F. Easy F. Like, fuck Kairos. But the Changeling, yes. The Changeling is one of the most powerful Legendary Lords in the game. Actually, the most powerful Legendary Lord. He's a Legendary Lord that you genuinely cannot lose a campaign with him. Like, for others, you might have to struggle to lose a campaign and try really hard. For him, I don't think it is even feasible to lose a campaign as him. And while there are issues for the Changeling in terms of fun factor, replayability, it's not a great campaign to play. The strength of the faction is ridiculous. Now, I want to make a point, by the way, about this. Some people would say, like, oh, the Changeling can be a great starter campaign. I disagree. I think a good starting campaign is a campaign where we actually learn mechanics that apply to the largest number of races in the game. Sure, every race is going to have its own unique mechanics, but actually having some level of challenge and something to worry about is how people learn to be better at the game. The Changeling will not teach you that. But in terms of strength, easy S tier. No discussion about that. And when I say Siege, I'm really referring to the Changeling. Kairos is irrelevant. Like, he's down there with Kugaf and Daniel as far as I see it. Vampire Coast, F tier. No discussion. The only saving graces of the Vampire Coast, good lords, good legendary lords in terms of combat strength, good heroes. Their economy is bad, their entire army roster might as well be non-existent. And playing a faction without no army is one of the worst experiences you can have in the game. So, because you just basically end up, you can make it work spamming mortars, but it's not a great experience. Aranessa is in a better position, like she would be a C tier if we're talking about Aranessa herself, but if we're talking about like the Vampire Coast as a whole, yeah, they're pretty bad. Their units die quickly. Their units collapse and go into the dust very quickly. This wasn't necessarily a problem in Warhammer 2 because having disposable units wasn't an issue, but Warhammer 3 is about building highly experienced armies, so keeping units alive is actually quite important, which is something the Vampire Coast struggles. Like, you can keep your units alive by not using them in battle, so when you're playing a Vampire Coast campaign, the best way to play it is basically pretend you don't have an army and win battles without that army. Yes, it's as bad as it sounds. So yeah, screw the Vampire Coast. They are in a better spot than Kugaf and Daniel, but not necessarily by as much as you might think. Vampire counts, A tier. Not having artillery and very limited range that are tied to a bloodline does hurt their potential, in particular in sieges, but they have incredibly strong lords, they have good heroes, and they can recruit high tier units from very early on in the campaign, which gives them a ridiculous level of strength. It's the limitations that they have with respect to the unit types they have, like with respect to artillery, with respect to range, that do limit them, because yeah, sieges are a thing and they do matter. If they had a wall breaker unit, if they had the ability of breaking down walls in sieges, they would be higher. It's not that they struggle necessarily in sieges, it's just there are limitations you're going to have to account for in a Vampire Counts campaign that other races don't have. And that leaves the Wood Elves and the Warriors of Chaos. I think everyone knows where these races deserve. Both of them are S tier. For the same reason, actually. Okay, so the reason is that both Wood Elves and Warriors of Chaos don't really care about taking a lot of territory themselves. They only care about those special fortress settlements that they have, right? So be it the trees or the dark fortresses. Those dark fortresses and trees are some of the most impregnable settlements on the entire campaign map. So it's very hard to screw that up. It's very hard to lose one of the settlements, assuming the AI even decides to attack you in one of those settlements. Furthermore, the armies that both of these guys have, the lords they have, the legendary lords, the heroes, the units are incredibly strong units. Be a Glade Guard for a Glade Guard, Treekin, Way Watchers for Wood Elves, even melee units for the Wood Elves. Yeah, Wood Elves actually have one of the strongest melee roster in the game. You just don't give a shit to use it because it's like, well, you use the monster units as melee units instead. Strong range units for the Wood Elves, strong melee units as well, monster units, and Warriors of Chaos, strong artillery and hell cannons, powerful legendary lords, vassals that help you out. Is nigh on impossible to lose a Warriors of Chaos campaign. You would have to really, really struggle to lose one, and it probably would only happen in the early game when you're most vulnerable. You can genuinely play an entire Warriors of Chaos campaign and not resolve your way for the entire damn thing from the very beginning. Maybe you fight a handful of battles, maybe you just fight the quest battles, but that is it. So that is my strength ranking for Total War Warhammer 3. Now, let me just mention this. I do not believe a strength ranking in isolation means anything. It's nice to understand which races are strong, it's nice to understand why they're strong, but ultimately the point of my channel is not just to talk about like, oh, which is the strongest. I may have started that out when Warhammer 3 came out, absolutely, but I think it's important to talk about like which are campaigns that are actually good. Now, people have their preferences, right? That's a discussion, but I do spend a lot of time and a lot of hours thinking about like, okay, which campaigns have potential, which campaigns have a good campaign dynamic, which campaigns are fun, which are not, right? Which campaigns are unique, which campaigns feel repetitive and boring. That's my issue with Scarbrand, really. He's repetitive and boring. Even if he does have a lot of strength. But you're going to have to fight a lot of battles manually to achieve that strength, just keep that in mind. But this is the pure strength ranking of races in Warhammer 3. Kostin here signing out. Don't forget to subscribe, like, and enable notifications, and stay tuned for more. I'll probably cover the individual legendary lords next. Oh, and that will be a spicy video, won't it?